Welcome back. We're celebrating a small but significant milestone with this show today. It's our 10th episode of the Economics for Inclusive Prosperity podcast, and we've already covered a broad range of topics with some of the world's leading economists, ranging from the past and future of the labor market to AI to meritocracy and zero-sum thinking to why inequality is a major structural problem for the world economy. So, if you're joining us for the first time, and even if you're not, we'd encourage you to go back and listen or watch some or all of our episodes on YouTube or Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcasting app. Today, we're talking about food, specifically agricultural R&D. The world's population has grown fourfold over the last century, from about 2 billion people to 8 billion people. That's a lot of mouths to feed. But the silver lining was that technology was advancing too, particularly during the so-called Green Revolution from the 1940s to the 1980s, when new high-yield grain varieties, fertilizers, and pesticides dramatically increased harvests around the world, including in developing nations like Mexico and India. But during that time, economists were also developing an economic theory called the Inappropriate Technology Hypothesis. It's a mouthful, but it basically says that technological innovations developed for wealthy countries are specifically designed for conditions and environments in those countries, meaning they were often unproductive or inapplicable in developing countries. Fast forward to today, when the effects of climate change, rising heat, drought, and extreme weather events are already affecting farmers around the world. That means we'll need even more technological breakthroughs to mitigate them. But will those technologies help where they're needed the most? In their research, economists Jacob Moscona of MIT and Karthik Sastry of Princeton have taken a new look at the intersection of the inappropriate technology hypothesis, they like to call it technological mismatch, and agricultural research and development. They say there is a systematic rich world bias in ag R&D that explains a large share of global disparities in both the adoption of new technology and in agricultural productivity. They're here today to discuss where that bias comes from, its effects, and some potential responses. So let's get to it. So your research says there's a systematic rich world bias in terms of agricultural innovation that explains like a big share of global inequality in technology adoption and productivity in the agriculture sector. And it says that you found that agricultural research and development is really concentrated in a handful of rich countries. Like 50% is occurring in North America, while on the other hand, like a majority of countries in sub-Saharan Africa don't have any kind of sort of private or seed breeding program at all. Why did you pick this particular field of study? How did you get here? What drew you to it? Jacob, do you want to start first?
Yeah, sure. So I think that both Karthik and I were really interested in what drives the focus of innovation, because if you go back to sort of standard models of economic growth, that's really important for understanding who benefits from technology, the direction the economy goes. Do we innovate a lot in sort of clean technology or dirty technology? And how does that shape the clean energy transition, stuff like that? And so the first paper we wrote together was actually not about economic development or productivity growth in developing countries, but actually was all about just within the US, trying to understand in agriculture to what extent innovation was reacting to climate change and shifting towards developing technologies that could help the US agricultural economy adapt to climate change. But in the course of working on that, we should have realized, well, one big reason why the direction of innovation matters is not because it allows, for example, certain farmers in the US to adapt to climate change or not, but because on average, it's just so much more focused on the US, full stop, than anywhere else in the world. And we saw a little bit of that actually in that climate change paper, where we show that while new technology is developed in response to the pattern of climate change in the US to help sort of US farmers adapt to climate change, it's not responding at all to, say, rising extreme heat in developing countries. But then just more generally, they got really interested in this point that, different parts of the world just need very different technologies, period, whether it is climate change, no climate change, whatever, because of all the ecological differences, all the differences in production processes. And we started just studying that directly and showing sort of like you said, that there really is the systematic focus of innovation toward rich world markets, especially the US, designing technologies that really match the specific ecological conditions of an Iowa and Indiana, et cetera, and not the ecological conditions of countries in Africa, many countries in Central America, South Asia, and that actually can explain a really large share of the productivity gaps between those different parts of the world.
Yeah.
The only thing I'll add to that is that we're not the first economists who are interested in maybe broader questions about technologies, how they're created, how they're diffused, how they affect human welfare, and chosen to apply that in the agricultural sector. And I think the really nerdy scientific reason and the kind of humanistic reason are potentially the same, which is that it's really easy to associate with and to measure economic outcomes in the agricultural sector in terms of technology usage and in terms of economic output and its effect on standards of living.
Yeah. Why
So
is
I
it?
think that's also an important part of it.
Yeah. Why is it easier in the ag sector than in other areas?
Because physical outputs are easy to measure using kind of standard tools and techniques going back pretty far in history and in a comparable way across different places in the world. And I think that is, and not to say that it's trivial, as a lot of work, of course, goes in to this kind of measurement, both in academics and in policy work. But you sort of have a better place to start.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the humanistic part of it. I mean, there is a lot at stake here. I mean, there were productivity differences um, before we really started, the climate issue became the climate crisis.
100%.
Um, and now it's sort of piling on the climate crisis. I guess we'll talk about that a little later. Um, but what are the sort of big picture things that are at stake here that you hope maybe your work on this can address and maybe help at least give people a better understanding
I
of
think
what the
one thing.
stakes are?
Mhm. Well, I think one thing that is perhaps not appreciated enough in the public conversation is that it's actually the agricultural sector where the cross-country differences in productivity are the largest. Like what might come to mind is, for example, manufacturing, like the difference between, high-tech manufacturing in the United States and the way that manufacturing is sort of practiced in 99% of the world. But, by standard economic measurement, it's the agricultural sector where there's the most immense differences in the sort of amount of output you get for the same index of inputs. And then it's kind of easy to see how this has particularly magnified effect on standards of living for the world's poorest. So I think you said it very nicely. Even in the quote status quo, there's kind of an enormous amount to understand about comparative standards of living in the world by looking at the agricultural sector. And indeed, in sort of a way that's quite foreboding, all these differences could be magnified immensely going forwards because of climate change.
Yeah. Two other things I'll add to that. Oops, sorry. It's just that, like, if you care about economic development and the well-being of the world's poorest, that means you almost have to care about the well-being of people in the agricultural sector and farmers. It's easy to forget in the U.S. We obviously consume a lot of food, but a relatively small number of people are actually engaged in farming. In developing countries, that's not true at all. And a really large share of especially the lowest income part of the population, is engaged in agriculture. That's number one. But number two is that, everybody needs to eat. And the way that the world is arranged today means that international trade in food is much less than it could be. Even within country trade in food is less than it could be because of costs associated with moving food across distances, a variety of political and economic forces that we can maybe get to sort of drive that. What that ends up meaning is that large parts of the world sort of end up producing their own food. So it's not just about the farmers themselves being less productive and being able to make, less money by selling that output. It's also about sort of access to food in different parts of the world. And as a result, the price of food that consumers in lower income countries face, that is the result of sort of how much food is coming out of the ground.
So it feels like one of the things we have to establish before we go further is really a good working definition of the inappropriate technology hypothesis. Now, it's been around since the late '60s when it was first developed by Joe Stiglitz and Anthony Atkinson, and it's been updated over the years. Most recently by, or more recently by Darren Alsamalo and Fabrizio Dilovati. Can you just give us sort of the ABCs of the inappropriate technology hypothesis and hopefully like a shorthand or nickname because it's such a mouthful to say, right?
Yeah,
Sure.
so I go for
Well,
it, Karthik.
no, well, we might be about to say almost exactly the same thing, but we can each take a stab at it.
Okay.
And we hopefully we'll sort of explain it. We may not be able to come up with a catchier name, to be clear. Although I'm also a little bit fond of technology mismatch hypothesis. I'm not sure that's any better.
It
So
is better, actually.
and to be honest, outside of context, where we want to cite, the exact prior literature, which uses the inappropriate technology phrase, we kind of like technology mismatch hypothesis as well. That could just be, useful in various ways here. Okay.
Yeah.
So to explain the technology mismatch hypothesis, it might help to take a step back and first ask, what is the view of the world that does not put the mismatch of technology front and center? So there, and I don't want to make this as too much of a straw man, but I think an influential and of course very important perspective in economics focuses more on what we call these general purpose technology. So it's a certain view of technology that is kind of unsurprisingly the first place that an economics textbook might start, which is that technologies are methods to create, say, more output from the same amount of inputs, the same amount of labor inputs or capital or materials. And moreover, kind of the interesting thing about technologies is that they're inherently very non-rival, to use a little bit more jargon, which is that if you have a great idea about, say, how to put A and B together to create C, you can kind of apply it in any which context and replicate it sort of throughout. Now, where this argument gets a little stickier is when we really drill down to sort of real life examples of what are these kind of mythical technologies that we speak of. How are they implemented? And is it really the case that it's just a magical blueprint that allows you to take, A and B and produce C? Are technologies really just magical blueprints that allow you to take, the same amount of water and soil and produce more corn? Not really. I mean, technologies are usually embodied in specific goods or specific means of production that carry with them an enormous amount of context, right? And that's where the technology mismatch hypothesis or inappropriate technology hypothesis steps in. It sort of says in a nutshell that technologies are going to come with this sort of let's say, it's a recipe, but it's a recipe with specific ingredients. And that recipe was designed by somebody who had those ingredients on hand, meaning, they had the right weather or an environment that they're living in. If we're thinking about agricultural technologies, they have the right access to skilled labor or high-tech machinery. If you're thinking about a manufacturing technology. And moreover, their incentives are to create a recipe that works with the ingredients that they have on hand. And then you hand that recipe to, the median person living somewhere else in the world. They don't have any of the ingredients. And because of this, I mean, it goes further and further. If we live in a world where all these recipes are being created by people who live in certain conditions and have access to certain things, we may end up in a world where we're sort of not developing the technologies that are applicable and potentially necessary, actually, to sort of improve standards of living in most of the world. So that might be my sort of best sort of definition of what's happening here.
Jacob, do you have anything
No,
to
I'll leave
add,
it
or
with
did
that.
he hit the nail on the head?
I can sound into that one. The only thing that I'll add is that there are a number of like reasons why it's both what Karthik said. It's like the fact that different parts of the world might need different recipes to become more productive because they just struck different kinds of ingredients, and the number of forces that exist in the world today that really push. I don't know how far we want to push the metaphor, but the recipe makers or the cooks or the innovators toward developing technologies for certain parts of the world and not others. And sort of one thing that pushes in that direction is sort of just differences in market size, willingness to pay, profit opportunities. Just these big rich world markets compared to markets with lower income people in them. Another is institutions, things like intellectual property protection that is really strong in certain parts of the world like the US, and for a variety of reasons, which we can also talk about, are sort of less strictly enforced often, whether or not they're on the books at all in other parts of the world, increases incentives further to develop technologies for those markets where patents are enforced and you can really sort of profit from developing and marketing those technologies. And finally, and this is what sort of Karthik was saying as well, a lot of innovation happens by people sort of looking out their window and observing the world around them. And that's what they know about. That's what they're thinking about. That's what they're bumping into every day. And they're developing new ideas and tools and technologies with that world in mind. And just the fact that there's so much investment in innovation in high income countries, and that's where a lot of innovators are sort of live and are bopping around and having their ideas, means that even absent that whole intellectual property system or those kinds of profit concerns, you might still get sort of a direction of innovation that pushes in that direction. Sort of one result that Karthik and I haven't published yet, but that we sort of see in data is that if we're really only about profits and not just the world you see around you, you might expect that bias toward like rich world topics would be much stronger in more profit-driven innovation, things like companies. In this case, we're looking at sort of biomedical innovation. So you might imagine the bio companies really care about like developing drugs for the US, but the scientists at universities who have more flexibility to care about the world sort of do that less. In fact, we don't find that that's true at all. If anything, we find that the scientists are as strongly directed toward studying topics that are relevant for rich countries like the US as the biotech companies. And there could be many reasons for that. One is the pattern of funding, including public funding, which itself
Right.
focuses on what the US needs, but also just what people are interested in, what is considered a sexy topic, what people decide to like look at and ask questions about. It's all of forces push toward, and that's great. I mean, it's great that people are inspired to work on things because they see them, but all in all, that pushes things in one direction, not another.
Yeah, because not even university researchers are immune from sort of public, um, you know, preference pressures and uh, those kind of considerations. It's interesting though, because the difference between the manufacturing sort of view of um, the situation and the agricultural one is that, manufacturing, you have sort of positive inputs, but like a lot of the inputs uh, in the agriculture area are negatives, right? You have to solve for these negatives, the CPPs, the crop
Mm-hmm.
pests and pathogens. And I thought that was really interesting because they're so um, their potential effect on agriculture is so great. It's something like they have the potential to reduce agricultural output by something like 50 to 80%, in certain cases. Um, and it's an example of how the differences, right? Because I think you um, in one of the maps you had in one of your studies, you sort of traced the habitat of the African maize stalk borer and the Western corn rootworm, and it was sort of like never the twain shall meet. Like one was, a rich
Mm-hmm.
country crop worm, and the other one was sort of a global South corn worm. Can you talk a little bit about those, um, the CPPs and how they, um, sort of what you found when you studied them
Mm-hmm.
and and
Absolutely. No,
yeah, go ahead, Karthik. That's great.
sure. Absolutely. And I think you also touched on an interesting and important subtlety about sort of how to compare what's happening in different domains. Where I would even draw the contrast that the sort of ecological constraints, the presence of pests and pathogens, these factors, which are so front and center in agriculture, what really differentiates them from what's going on in manufacturing is that they're kind of immutable through the process of economic development and over short time horizons. You can make an economy more you can make it more capital intensive or more skilled through sort of investments in infrastructure, investments in education. You can't change the weather, at least in a localized way. Or to the extent that humans can change the weather, it's mainly in a profoundly negative way that happens over longer time horizons. But just to loop back and explain a little bit, one thing that we think is really interesting about the agricultural setting and sort of what we ended up kind of exploring in some detail in our paper together about inappropriate technology is that you can really put a name and a face on what these ecological differences across places are and how they are targeted and affected by technology. So to put this all into context, at a very abstract level, one of the kind of broad innovations, let's say, in crop breeding over the last several hundred years has been how to manipulate the genetic code of plants to become more resistant to pests and insects. So this is a story that's as old as human agricultural cultivation itself, insofar as people have always been fighting the war against agricultural pests and pathogens, and moreover, trying to fight it through various forms of selective breeding, right? So what would that look like? We know that, for example, um, wheat stalks tend to sort of fall over and then be beset by fungus. If you can breed, specific stalks of wheat that produce plentiful grain but don't have that property, hey, those are the winners. Let's take those. Or if we're thinking about insect resistance, it's often a similar process. And of course, that gets kicked into a higher and higher gear as we learn more and more about genetics. And then sort of the final or the current frontier, let's say, in that war are various genetic modification or GM techniques that go right into the genetic code and try to change organisms to make them more resistant to insects. So on the one hand, this is a very general idea, right? That you take even the specific idea that you could engineer genes in particular to make plants more insect resistant. And that basic idea expressed that way is applicable to sort of the production of all foodstuffs in all parts of the world. But where things get trickier is when we start sort of thinking a little bit more and interrogating more. So how do you actually do this? So what is the process by which we use all of our scientific ingenuity to create more insect resistant wheat or corn or soybeans using these techniques? Well, what you really have to do is something quite a bit more specific, at least in terms of kind of modern scientific understanding, as well as our modern standards for safety. So first you identify not just a general foe, like worms or insects in general, but a specific foe. And one example in the US that you referenced is this Western corn rootworm, which is, the sort of ubiquitous character in the U.S. I mean, I remember, my first exposure to Western corn rootworms is we used them for science experiments in 5th grade because, if you throw some little worms in, like a small aquarium-like thing, they'll, still be there and be quite a bit bigger in a week. So this is sort of a well-known foe, and in the ag industry in the U.S., it's called the billion-dollar bug. Just as like
My
its
God.
nickname among people in ag and ag biotech because of its potential damage to corn crops. So you find your foe, you find the corn rootworm, the billion-dollar bug, and then you try to develop a technique that would be harmful to the corn rootworm, but not to other flora and fauna, including other insects, other animals, and you and me. Right. So
Right.
the going method for doing this, and this was kind of developed through kind of a really big chain of scientific reasoning and some sort of kind of completely happenstance discoveries and some more targeted ones, is to get plants to produce these proteins called crytoxins that dissolve the intestinal, have been shown to dissolve the intestinal linings of the young larvae of particular kinds of insects. So, to put a long story short, and of course it's something that biologists would be able to describe in much more technical detail. You find the exact protein that's bad for the corn rootworm and not for other worms and not for you and me. And then you get into the genetic code and then you alter, say, a corn plant to produce this toxin. And doing this, even that is making it sound way too simple. Because doing this requires an enormous amount, at least at our current understanding of genetics, an enormous amount of trial and error. There's even evolution working against you, and sort of all sorts of details about implementation that matter. But sort of the end result of this, what it looks like from our perspective is that genetically modified corn varieties, for example, are sort of continuously updated to sort of take into account the most recent genetic trends, and they're designed for application in really specific biomes or parts of the world where they actually, are resistant to the local pests. So then, you overlay this with everything that we've kind of talked about so far. So economic incentives are going to kick this into higher and higher gear, because where is it in the world that you can make the most money? Releasing your sort of 2.0, 3.0, 4.0 versions of insect-resistant corn. Well, it's the countries in the world with effective intellectual property regulation for seed varieties, which is itself a contentious issue, and it's one that farmers know a lot about, right? The idea that you have to pay top dollar for new seeds every year and you can't
Right.
replant them the next year. So it's going to be particular markets. It's going to be places where the sort of scientific and university ecosystem are most well established. And again, the United States and places in Western Europe are likely going to be towards the top of that list, right? Where there are, hundreds of newly minted PhDs every year who are kind of furthering the frontier science of understanding the exact ecological conditions and characteristics because of these profit incentives, but also kind of other sort of softer incentives. The fact that that's just people's lived environment. It's not going to be, for example, markets in sub-Saharan Africa or markets in India where plant intellectual property is not enforced in the same way that it is in, say, the United States, and the scientific infrastructure is also further and further behind. But in those places, there are different threats. Like the example that you raised, which comes up in our article, of the African maize stalk borer, which is one of the predominant threats to maize production in sub-Saharan Africa. So when you combine kind of both of these factors, which is or all several of these factors, which is the specificity that technological solutions need to have in order to be effective. The fact that, if there's finite resources to throw at the problem, you're going to throw them at the specific problems that, you know the most about scientifically and or might make you the most money. And finally, that these threats are actually just vastly different in different parts of the world. If you take the corn from Indiana, it's not necessarily going to grow in Western Kenya or in India. That's really how sort of all the factors of inappropriate technology or technology mismatch come together in practice.
Right. I think you quantified it by looking at patents, right?
Correct.
Yeah. What did you find there?
So as one of kind of our first tests in this analysis, what we did is we looked systematically at patents to understand just to what extent innovations are targeted towards specific crop pests and pathogens. And in the raw patent data, there was all of these really striking statistics.
One, just
Let me
without doing any
pull one up,
analysis, is that
actually, too.
sorry?
No,
No,
go.
literally
Yeah.
1/3 of all agricultural patents are about this pest and pathogen issue, or talking about trying to develop pest and pathogen resistance. So just like at the starting gate, a really large share of agricultural innovation is focused on these issues. And then that's number one. And number two is that one nice thing about the patent data, alongside data that we put together ourselves on sort of actual transfer of uniquely identified seed varieties. So not just are you patenting this particular technology here and then transferring that technology to some other country, but are you literally like developing some seed variety over here and then transferring it to some other country for use? You can use that to actually track how technologies flow in practice across countries and the extent to which that flow is predicted by the mismatch in the underlying environmental characteristics. So basically to test exactly the story that Karthik was just telling. Like one possibility is that sure, all these technologies are designed in the US, but actually, there are these small ecological differences, but people want to adopt them anyway, and they work just as well kind of no matter what, and so they diffuse everywhere. We show that's exactly not true. And it's not true in exactly the way Karthik described, meaning these technologies do diffuse to places that just so happen to look pretty ecologically similar to the US along margins that we can quantify, like the specific pests and pathogens that are attacking each crop in each part of the world, but they don't diffuse at all in exactly the places where that pest and pathogen composition is not aligned or is more mismatched. And so that's how we use the
Right.
data.
I think you found that for the median value of CPP mismatch, right?
Mhm.
Technology diffusion was reduced by 44%. Can you just explain that a little further? So
Yeah.
that
So basically, like what we're saying is that we have there's lots, like I was saying before, there are lots of differences in terms of your ecological mismatch and similarity for the places that have places that sort of want to use seed varieties. Some places happen to be pretty close ecologically to the places for which those varieties are developed. Some places are really far. They're going to get like few to no varieties diffusing to them because little of the technologies that are getting developed actually work at all. And so you might just get very little. The median is just a way of saying, like, on average, how
right.
match our countries ecologically from the places that are developing that technology, and how much is this reducing sort of their technology flows.
So the diffusion was reduced by half, even just for the median.
Exactly.
That's
Exactly.
a big
And much
loss
larger in
of
other parts of the
diffusion.
world
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Because we've sort of been touching on this for the last little bit, but it's interesting the whole difference between sort of public and private, because
Hmm.
obviously market forces are playing a big role in the in the wealthier countries, but I think the number is something like 90% of R&D funding in sort of poorer countries is coming from the government side. Is there, because I want to talk about Brazil in a minute,
Mhm.
which had a very significant public program that you wrote a paper about. But how how much does that public versus private matter? What is the disparity between where that funding come from? Because I think it's something like 50 to 60% private now. Um, in the richer countries, what is that? Does that disparity have meaning, like, in the real world?
You mean in the U.S. between private and public?
Yeah, no, I mean, in terms of, like, does it matter where the money comes from? If as long as it's being funded, right? Even, like, in the poor countries, like, funding's coming from the government. In the US, a lot of that R&D money is coming from the private sector.
Oh,
Is
yeah.
that does that make a difference, like, in terms of efficacy?
In terms of efficacy, that's not, a result that we have in our work. One thing you do see, though, pretty clearly in the data, I think, is how these two things are complementary. Like, if you look at the history of the U.S., for example, a lot of the early research before now you have these kind of big companies that are sort of engines for themselves. But a lot of the initial R&D, we have another collaborator, Alex Wally, who studies this kind of directly, was driven by public investment. The government building out experiment stations in different parts of the country. The U.S. isn't, we're talking about the U.S. as like all this research is in the U.S. The U.S. is a big place and has a lot of different ecological conditions and ecological diversity within it. And one thing the U.S. government did pretty consciously was learn about those different ecological niches in the U.S. by building out experiment stations, land grant universities funded by the government as a way of sort of building the U.S.'s knowledge about um, agricultural production, and then private companies, which have sort of um, really took off kind of in the 1930s with the advent of hybridization, but really just kind of more and more since then, have built in large part on that knowledge and contributed a ton to it. But it was really this kind of back and forth that was, I think, really important in the U.S. In other parts of the world, you see that things are dominated by the public sector, in large part because of what Karthik was describing about the sort of limited incentives that exist for private firms to really enter due to sort of the little profit opportunities that might exist there. But there are these sort of examples of public funding. The Green Revolution, which we might get to later, is a really famous example of philanthropically funded innovation in different parts of the world having huge positive consequences in places where the private sector hadn't yet entered in the 60s and 70s. And then the last thing I'll say is that, you mentioned Brazil. Brazil started off in the 70s, and this is the paper that we have sort of another paper about this, as a sort of big public investment in agricultural R&D to sort of build out an innovation ecosystem for agriculture in Brazil. But Brazil is now today a major site of private sector technology development and diffusion, which, I think it's an open question, but I think Karthik and I probably agree that wouldn't have been possible at all had the public sector not sort of laid the groundwork, for many decades, both on the innovation side, but also just building out the sort of big agricultural market. And then the private sector saw that and said, like that may now make sense for us to enter, and there's just knowledge that we can build on, et cetera. So I think
Yeah,
it's played. That's what's important.
Just to build on that very last point, I think a theme that emerges in our work and some of the other work that Jacob referenced about American agricultural development, and it's kind of broadly consistent with how I think about this in economic theory, is that when the challenges are large, they include a lot of risk, and they're also kind of geographically and scientifically spread out. Those last two things tend to be very correlated in agriculture. That there are sort of a lot of actual different places and ecological niches that hit, and sort of a lot of different knowledge bases that are required for them. When those conditions are met, the private sector seems less effective at jumping in and finding solutions by itself to these problems. And then sort of the other thing that often goes along with that in stages of development is when property rights are either less developed or kind of hard to even provide. And I think the Brazilian example is kind of good for this. It's again a little bit harder for some of these developments to be catalyzed um, catalyzed purely by the private sector. Although it's not to say it's impossible, but it's at least less consistent with historical experience that we know of.
Yeah.
yeah. Can we talk a little bit about Brazil and Embrapa, which is an acronym
Yeah.
for the Brazilian Agricultural Research Corporation? I'm not even going to attempt the Portuguese.
Jacob will.
It was created in 73, right? It operates under the Ministry of Agriculture, and it was a tremendous success, right? I mean, it raised agricultural productivity by over 100% with a cost benefit ratio of 17-1. I mean, that's pretty extraordinary. I mean, it's sort of
Yeah.
the
Almost return on
ideal of what
investment.
you
Like, come on.
yeah, what it's the ideal of what you want from public investment, right? What in when your study of it, what were the specific pieces of it that you thought allowed it to be as effective as it has been? The pieces of its approach.
Yeah. I can start to, Karthik, I'm sure was going to want to jump in as well. But I think one piece is just this idea of a country that is not one of the normal, innovator set of countries deciding to invest in innovation itself. I think that was like a big idea, and in and of itself, it's a pretty big leap from most programs, either publicly funded or philanthropically funded, that really try to facilitate technology adoption and all the barriers to adopting technology that already exists. The sort of visionaries at the helm of Embrapa at the time, but a chief among them, someone who we quote a lot in the paper, Eliseu Alves, who also became president of Embrapa, observed, look, like the problem in Brazil isn't that we're not adopting technology. The problem is that we have this ecologically diverse country. We have some parts of the country that look geographically, ecologically distinct from anywhere that they're doing agriculture in the world. We just don't have the science, necessary for understanding how to do agriculture in these places in the first place. We need to go and understand these ecosystems, design technologies that actually might work there. And only then can we really unlock these parts of the country that at the time were basically being used for relatively unproductive sort of ranching and activities like that. And so just this idea to invest in innovation was really important. That's number one. Number two, this idea of really putting this technology mismatch point front and center. One thing they might have done, and you could totally imagine a policymaker thinking this, is we're going to build a big innovation lab in the place where, we currently have the biggest university or where the seat of government is or in the biggest city, and we're going to throw all of our attention at that one big lab. They instead said, no, no, no. We're going to actually put research in all the different parts of the country that we actually want to learn about. Get researchers to go and learn about those different regions and really spread out this process of innovation. And like Karthik said, it's exactly the process where you might actually need the government most, because how could you convince a private sector to enter in all these places with really limited pre-existing
Yeah.
institutions, research institutions, etc.? They built out all these different institutions in different parts of the country.
Yeah, it was like 46 of them, right? 46 different
Exactly.
labs. Yeah. And could you imagine like asking some private company, hey, could you go study the Amazon's potential as a
Exactly. To your point about 17-1, like what we find, we can, using our estimates about the consequences of the program and some modeling, we can say not only what was the effect of the program overall, and that's where we get that 17-1 benefit cost ratio. But if you said, what if they invested the same amount of money, but they threw it all in Rio, which was really the sort of center for research at the time, and where the big botanical garden is, et cetera, you would have gotten benefits that were about, I think, a third or less than a third of what you got from the actual program. And because the cost is the same, the benefit cost ratio goes down by a really large amount if you would have invested the same amount of money in a different strategy. And the final point that I'll make, the final, I think, ingredient for the success, and I'm sure Karthik will want to expand on this, is just the way in which they managed to really get people to pursue education in the agricultural sciences, both initially abroad, but then also sort of in Brazil. And we're able to populate these research centers with people who had, PhDs in the relevant fields. By the, 2000, they were employing as many PhD researchers as the USDA in the United States. So it was really about investing, and a lot of that was funded by Embrapa itself. So part of the cost that we put in that benefit cost is the cost of incentivizing and funding this higher education of the people who would end up sort of working in all these different labs. And I think that was a huge piece of the success as well.
Yep.
I'm not sure I don't have anything to add to that. That is kind of precisely under the purview of the study that you referenced, that Jacob and I and our co-authors Heitor Pellegrina and Ariel Ackerman were able to do. I'll add something that Jacob may or may not agree with. So it's a riskier statement, but I do think it's true, and I think it matters for like a more general conversation about these topics.
Always good to add a
Another
little drama to the podcast.
little drama. No, I think another important ingredient here is really just the continuity of the program and its ability to kind of like motivate people in the national mission. I do think that's quite important.
Yeah.
And I think sort of it's another easy place for these kinds of investments to run aground. that, there's this core set of founders, let's say, who have a certain vision for it, but then, the political will is lost in 5 to 10 years. And, for these technological, for the development cycle for everything that Embrapa was doing, the development cycle for crop varieties is already measured in units of, 5 or 10 or decadal increments, right? And then, the career trajectories for the process that Jacob was describing, which is investing in human capital. It's a bit nerdy. I mean, what that means is that, there are people in the world who, did PhDs in agricultural sciences because of this national scale investment and the feeling that something was being built here. There's people who, in the early stages maybe had already done these degrees and decided to come back to Brazil as opposed to um, leaving the country and going elsewhere. But, in modern times, there are kind of entire agricultural research programs at universities, outside and inside of Brazil that exist because of the potential for employment and the big goals of this program, right? And if at any point the plug was pulled and it was just said, oh, now we've had a turnover of government and we don't want this anymore, you would have never been able to create all of those kind of stronger long run foundations, I guess.
Yeah.
For this
For better or
program.
worse, I would totally agree with that. For people who haven't seen the recent Oscar-nominated movie, The Secret Agent, like in 1973, Brazil was in a dictatorship. I mean, this was all a project that started under a right-wing government. Then Brazil had a transition to democracy. Then it's had sort of a series of very different-looking administrations since then, sort of including the last few that have really gone from one end of the political spectrum to the other. And then Embrapa sort of continued all the way through, and that was not by accident. I mean, I think that we actually, when we started working on this project, uh, did a series of interviews with people who worked at Embrapa, and one person who was there sort of in the 70s and 80s was telling us about how they really were conscious about branding this as like a national program for the sort of good of the agricultural sector for all people in Brazil. The seed varieties were branded with Embrapa, so the farmers would be really excited about them and excited about the investment. This is something that, like, I think for a variety of reasons, we've talked to Brazilians, most people would be really proud of and see as like a sort of a national source of pride in many ways. And I think that was part of what has led it to, because you could totally imagine, I mean, thinking about sort of the U.S. today, it started by one administration, the next administration pulled the plug, and that hasn't happened despite wild swings of the pendulum. And yeah, I totally agree that that's a really important part of the whole story.
And another interesting part of the story, actually, Ralph, because you mentioned the Amazon, a cool thing that Jacob got to do is he was able to travel to Embrapa Western Amazon in Manaus and kind of see what Embrapa looks like today. And you got a very interesting impression of kind of how the fire still burns, so to speak, among scientists and policymakers in Embrapa today.
Yeah, no, it's really cool. I mean, they're out there like, an hour and a half outside of Manaus, which is kind of the big city in the Amazon, and they have fields and fields, which you can't actually enter most of where they're doing the work and experimentation and test fields because they don't want to bring anything in for obvious reasons. But, you know, but if there's fields and fields with ongoing experimentation, including, figuring out sort of new varieties of crops for the Amazon. I was taken to like an experiment going on right now related to acai and, acai planting out there. But like, they're also just, buildings of labs with sort of students in them. I went shut up on some random day, and it just felt like totally alive, which is really fun and really interesting.
Yeah. So switching to climate change, because we said we would sort of circle back to it. Um, it's it seems like it's a a significantly complicating variable that's sort of coming in and kind of adding uncertainty. And how are you sort of working climate change into the models? Because it seems like in a way it's a bit of trying to hit a moving target. And um, talk a little bit about how you sort of work in climate to
Hmm.
this whole scenario.
Yeah, I
So,
think the moving target point is part of the challenge, not just for our research, but for sort of this whole idea of technology mismatch, because now not only do you have these big differences between places in fixed characteristics, like you have this bug and I have that bug, but now we also have these changing sort of year by year, certainly decade by decade, challenges to production that themselves might also look very different in different parts of the world. So you're layering on top of everything we've already been talking about, changes in the climate that could look sort of very different. Also, that as we sort of showed in our earlier work, also are the focus of innovation. But again, that innovation is focused on certain markets and not others. So to the extent that you're, you know, innovation becomes more important because now year after year, decade after decade, as Karthik was saying, you have to keep updating these technologies to adjust to all these changes in the environment, increased exposure to extreme heat, increased likelihood of sort of flooding along the coast. You're doing that process in some parts of the world, but you're not doing that process in other parts of the world. And so you could see a widening gap, I think, between rich and poor places.
Hmm.
The one optimistic take on all of this, which comes up sort of in a more speculative section at the end of that paper, is that one thing that climate change does, for better or worse, is it might lead different parts of the world to inherit a more similar set of threats. So as currently high-income countries warm up, they might actually start to inherit some of the pest and pathogen threats that previously only lived in developing countries, like, in terms of human diseases. Texas is now seeing examples of things like dengue and other human diseases that it wouldn't have sort of not long ago. And people are studying that process. But the same is true for agriculture. And so to the extent that now the rich world has to care about all these issues that are affecting it, that previously only affected poor countries, that might have the mitigating effect of coordinating innovation toward a more common set of global threats. But that is like searching for a silver lining, I think.
Right. Yeah. It's like the least encouraging silver linings department.
Well,
Uh,
Maybe. But then, you could also take the same idea and find some not very silver linings. Like there are also kind of climatic threats to agriculture that potentially won't be universally shared.
yeah,
Like, in the parts of the world, um, you know, that are sort of both coastal and rice farming. For example, think of, most of Bangladesh or parts of Southeast Asia that could be underwater in 20 to 30 years. Like, I think
right.
maybe a primary challenge is how to come up with rice varieties that can deal with saltwater inundation and saltwater intrusion. And, I don't think that is something that, necessarily has an analog in the West.
right.
So, or just the intensity of, existing issues like extreme heat or mosquito-borne illness, to bring back a human health example that Jacob mentioned. I mean, it could still be vastly different and become more different as a result of climate change.
Yeah. And I
Um,
think there's also some domestic policy sort of responses that are also complicating where um, countries try to mitigate the effects of climate change on their domestic food consumers, and that has
Right.
ripple effects um, for producers and people in markets where they're importing food. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Totally. And I will do you one worse by kind of bundling it together with some other research in the same spirit that Jacob and I have done with collaborators about kind of the uneven incidence of climate change as it stands and the kind of additional distortions that can create in the world. So in a first research paper that you referenced, Ralph, Jacob and I and Alan Shao of Stanford University studied how countries use policy to respond to climate-induced food shortages. And our finding there, quite uniformly across the world, countries rich and poor with even very different political systems, was that governments tend to respond to climate-induced food shortages by trying to um, subsidize food for consumers. And the thinking behind this is kind of very consistent with what we know about the redistributive role of agricultural policy and food policy in most parts of the world, which is that it's sort of an extremely politically valent issue. And these sort of crises are sort of very damaging to democracies and non-democracies alike. So the kind of net result of this is that a lot of what happens when there are these climate-induced food shortages, either very acute and short-term or kind of slower-moving long-run effects of climate change, is that countries put in place these kind of band-aid corrective policies that are kind of pushing around the economic incidence and also potentially just offloading it on other countries in the world. So that's kind of a first observation
But just kind of
about,
as one example, which is the example that we start the paper with, just to make it super concrete.
yeah.
These are things people are probably familiar with reading about all the time. It hasn't necessarily been put in these words. Like, you know, we sort of opened the paper with this story where the wheat producing region of India experienced a big heat wave and a decline in wheat output. So what that would normally do is, potentially increase the price of food, and Indian consumers would have to sort of pay more when they want to sort of get food that year. The Indian government was really worried about that, and citing for food security reasons, also maybe for political reasons, and then citing that food security concern, ban the exports of wheat. So that's the kind of interventions we're talking about. The Indian government says we're not going to allow sort of wheat to get exported. What does that do? Well, it reduces prices, because now it keeps that whole supply of wheat domestically, so it reduces the price of wheat that consumers are facing. But now the producers, who by the way just got hit by a bad climate year, now their prices are also brought down. So the total revenue is brought down by that relatively low wood event that they just had the climate shock and things sort of worked out as normal. So then they're basically getting kicked while they're down. And then the rest of the world, now they don't have access to India's wheat that they otherwise might have had access to. So that pushes up prices elsewhere in the world. So exactly like Karthik is saying, like on the one hand, you're shielding your domestic consumers who might be important for political reasons or, for a variety of reasons. But you're doing that by kicking your farmers when they're down and offloading that price increase sort of elsewhere in the world. And the net effect of all of this is actually that climate change is increasing on average these barriers to trade that exist in food over time, which further means that different parts of the world have to be sort of self-sufficient in food production, which is a problem going back to our first sort of part of the conversation. It's sort of certain parts of the world which is really unproductive because they don't have productive technology to work with. Sorry, Karthik was like in the middle of his.
Well, and then there's sort of a second piece of related, probably bad news, but let's just call it news, which is about land use and deforestation. So here, there's kind of an old debate in economics, but also spilling over into agronomy and agricultural science about what is the relationship between shifters of agricultural productivity and agricultural land use. So on the one hand, there's a very conventional economics intuition that if you get better at something, you do more of it. If you get worse at something, you do less of it. And that's consistent with, formally or informally, the notion of comparative advantage and specialization due to comparative advantage. On the other hand, there's a prevailing intuition that I think is potentially more common among agronomists and among development economists, that logic just really doesn't seem to apply to agriculture in particular, that everyone's got to eat, and food markets are quite localized. So agricultural productivity enhancements are the forces that allow the agricultural sector to shrink, and that might be a good thing, both in terms of both freeing up people and freeing up land. And it's the low productivity of agriculture that traps an enormous amount of land and resources in that sector. A very famous proponent of this idea was Norman Borlaug himself, the Nobel laureate and famous agronomist of a sort of great influence on plant breeding and policy during the Green Revolution, who kind of put out this often called the Borlaug hypothesis, that advancements in agricultural productivity in the tropical world in particular were some of the biggest contributors towards conserving land and conserving forests in the 20th century. So what does this have to do with climate change? Well, the bare reality is climate change has already had an enormous incidence, since the mid-20th century. And because of just the inherent sort of convexity of climate damages and temperatures, and I mean, that was jargon, but like places that are already hot are getting a lot hotter, and that's where a lot of the damages of climate change are concentrated. It's places that are already near the equator and regularly experience temperatures above, say, 30, 32 degrees C. Now we're bumping that to 34, 35. Because of that, we know that agricultural damages are concentrated in these tropical regions. And there's a question, this is kind of the opposite of everything Borlaug was thinking about. He wanted to improve technology in the tropics, but nature is disimproving agricultural productivity in the tropics. How does that affect deforestation and land use? It seems to be leading, this is what we find empirically in this study, to significantly more deforestation, and that's explained by agricultural expansion. And it's happening kind of exactly where the economics of the Borlaug hypothesis seem most likely to bite, which is places that are relatively remote and have inelastic and localized markets for food in particular. So it's another sort of cause for concern. So if you think of that as a description of some kind of status quo, one in which there's these very large unabated climate damages, especially in tropical parts of the world, then our research is suggesting that that could lead to kind of an enormous loss of land and sort of other things that we can and should be worried about, like loss of tropical forest habitat and biodiversity.
So speaking of things we should be worried about, I wanted to turn to what your recommendations are. Like, let's flip the script a little bit. I know you've made some recommendations. I know you identified some locations of crop specific breeding that could generate new technologies that had a relatively low technology mismatch in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. You also talked about modeling. So can each of you give me one or two recommendations for policy change or policy adoption that you think would push things in a positive direction or back towards a positive direction, because they seem to be going in the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, I can start, and then we'll see where this goes. I think we're both a little bit more reluctant to opine about sort of policy ideas and policy suggestions, but I think one at least that like follows directly from the work that we've done is just its importance of investing in innovation. People have sort of studied this and just found that like the return to public R&D, we find 17 in our particular context. Some studies from the US find between 5 and 10, but kind of regardless of what you think the number is, huge returns to public investment in R&D. Our work shows that those returns are still there, even in a country that's sort of not, one of your typical high income countries. So really high in Brazil. And moreover, I think the framework that we sort of outline, this whole idea of technology mismatch, gives you a way of thinking about where the returns to that investment might be highest. And it's where you think in the current innovation equilibrium, technology mismatch is the highest, meaning the places that are least served by the technologies that are getting developed today, because the conditions of those places and the kinds of technology they actually need and might benefit from are just not the ones that are being focused on by innovators. So investment in R&D in particular, in developing countries perhaps, and then targeted in this way, which is kind of like what Embrapa did. They kind of spread the love, for lack of a better word, across all these different regions, and in doing so, really reduce the technology mismatch of different parts of the country. So that's kind of number one. But number two, one of the things that we sort of also see in that paper about Brazil is that once they spread things out a certain amount, the returns to additionally spreading things out were kind of limited, because now, you have a center here. I don't know if someone's listening, they can't see me pointing, but you have, a center in two parts of Brazil. Throwing one down like right in the middle of those two might have more limited returns, because now by combining what you already kind of have with the other two, you've already learned about those different ecosystems. Putting one that's kind of some combination of those two in the middle might have, it still might matter, because there are going to be some differences, but not nearly as much as those first two in these totally unexplored areas. And so that you can think of that as like sort of analogously what that means for sort of research in different parts of the world. Where now that Brazil has a really great center for agricultural innovation, perhaps that means that you don't necessarily need one in other countries who are ecologically similar to Brazil, because now Brazil is developing that technology and can sort of export it there. Now, the next place you might want to look is somewhere that's really ecologically dissimilar from both Brazil and the US, but also now it means there are potentially large returns to figuring out how to transport and translate that technology developed in Brazil for other developing countries. So there's something that people have called of South-South technology transfer, or technology transfer and trade amongst developing countries, could be really important as well. And you see some examples of that in the case of Embrapa, working with sort of bringing that technology to parts of Western and Central Africa, where ecological conditions look pretty similar to some regions in central Brazil. And some other work with collaborators that studied the sort of rise of China in innovation, not in agriculture, and sort of like startups and high tech innovation. And one thing we see there is that actually had huge benefits way beyond China's borders, because a lot of the kinds of startups and sort of technologies that sort of Chinese entrepreneurs were developing for China, it just so happened also worked really well in other developing countries. But one of the kinds of things getting developed in Silicon Valley, because in Silicon Valley, you're not thinking about how to sort of build fintech for people that are unbanked, how to develop sort of online platforms for primary education in rural areas. But you are in China, and those things also have potentially broad applicability in South America and Africa and South Asia, et cetera. So I think that, so number one is that investment innovation, which is something that like, for some reason, development economists don't think that much about, maybe as much as they should, but like investment in innovation, but in a smart, targeted way, thinking about this mismatch idea. And number two is this idea of sort of South-South technology transfer, innovation transfer, and the potential benefits of that.
I think Jacob, by going first, has
That's
hit
why I grabbed
the.
it. I knew I
That's
wouldn't
why
be.
he grabbed it. It has really hit the most first order things. And just to quickly reiterate, I mean, I think for too long people have, I mean, not all people, but maybe the median of the economics profession has thought of these questions of technology development and economic development as too disjoint from one another. And I just don't think that's necessarily correct either for looking forward to the world we're going to inhabit with all of these new challenges coming on the horizon. I mean, including but not limited to climate change, but also looking backwards towards, for example, the development of the US economy or the sort of ongoing development of the Chinese economy. I think the role for technological development, human capital, investments in higher education there is underappreciated, but I think it's kind of staring us plainly in the face. For the sake of adding something, I will say something. Maybe you could interpret this as entirely self-serving. You'll see why in a second, and a little bit more kind of just about the methods and the policy conversation, which is I would certainly like to see a much bigger role for this thinking about technology mismatch and inappropriate technology in the design of economic policies. I think R&D policies and scientific funding policies are primary, you know, place to think about this, but also the broader conversation about intellectual property, the broader conversation about industrial policy. I just think research on these topics has produced like an enormous wealth of information and findings that under this broader umbrella of technology mismatch are really closely related to each other. So we talked in this conversation about some of our own research about technology mismatch in agriculture, which builds upon just a huge amount of kind of existing knowledge, for example, among practitioners of the Green Revolution. I think um, the Borlaug probably knew some or all of this kind of in his own experiences and his own scientific work. Jacob brought up some of his own really cool recent research about how this plays out in the world of high-tech startups and venture capital. So again, that's something that I think is in the air, that tech companies that are funded by VCs in China look different than the ones funded by VCs in India, which look different than the ones in the United States, which are, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, that's another angle of this. Human health has come up in a few contexts. I mean, there is a lot of study of this in economics by economists like Rachel Glenister and Michael Kramer. There's also just an enormous amount that's known and well written about by scholars of tropical medicine, like Dr. Peter Hotez at the Baylor College of Medicine, who is sort of like an influential person in that area. And again, I think they all fit under the same framework once you start thinking about the sort of specificity of technology, the sort of ingredients list for the recipes that we talked about earlier, and all the economic incentives that can drive of sort of the kind of unequal direction of technological progress and the unequal diffusion across contexts. When you use this sort of, careful, formal thinking about technology mismatch to design programs, I think you not necessarily will, but you can get programs like Embrapa that were based on a pretty conscious and clear-sighted understanding of what were the most kind of underfunded areas, or not underfunded, but say underdeveloped areas of agricultural science. And I think we're really able to quickly and decisively identify areas in which one could make rapid progress. And it sort of did that by thinking about technology mismatch and inappropriate technology in a horizontal way. Like we have some of these stereotypes kind of exist in the world, right? You want to invest in, upstream stuff that's not profitable. It's kind of theoretical and nerdy. That's where the government should step in. But Embrapa is a great example of, no, actually focusing on quite applied research, but still recognizing that there are types of applied research that could hit the ground and affect productivity and affect lives quite quickly, that just because of the incentive structure we live in, and sort of the mechanics of technological progress would still be kind of under researched, and in which it would be possible to make a quick and decisive impact. So, in maybe many fewer words, just to sum up, I think there is a lot of knowledge across domains that can be unified from this perspective of technology mismatch. And I think it could have a pretty big impact on policy and sort of, I would love to see it a little bit more in the conversation.
Well, thank you both for being here. This was a really fascinating conversation about some pretty significant challenges, but it also, I don't know, personally made me feel better about better ways to understand it better and maybe help push things in a positive direction. So thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks for having us. That's nice to hear.
Thanks so much, Ralph.
Thanks for being here. This podcast is a production of Economics for Inclusive Prosperity, a network of leading economists looking beyond neoliberalism and economic nationalism to answer the question, how do we build a more inclusive, more sustainable, and more prosperous economy for everyone? The co-directors of the Economics for Inclusive Prosperity Network are Danny Roderick, Suresh Naidu, Stephanie Stancheva, Atif Mian, and Ilyana Kuzhenko. Our show is produced in collaboration with the Reimagining the Economy project at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. The co-producer of this podcast is Tony Ditta. Please join us again in 2 weeks for another new episode. And if you like our content, please share us on social media and remember to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or your favorite podcasting app.